Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon to people joining from the West Coast. And good morning for those who just woke up to join this forum from Korea. I know it is early morning there. My name is Jieun, Secretary of National Unification Advisory Council, Toronto chapter. I will be your MC for the opening ceremony. National Unification Advisory Council, NUAC, is a constitutionally recognized organization to advise the President of the Republic of Korea on national unification issues. NUAC has organized a series of Korea Peace Forums, and today's forum has unique Canadian perspective. We'll begin the forum with a short opening ceremony, starting with the national anthems. Korean national anthem, followed by the Canadian national anthem. Please rise if you are in a position to do so. Now, I would like to ask Mr. Hyun-Soo Kim, head of the NUAC Toronto chapter, for his welcome message.
안녕하십니까. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, on behalf of the National Unification Advisory Council, Toronto chapter, I thank you for your attending today's Korea Peace Forum. Your attendance today encourages me as a sign of your strong support for righteousness in securing the peace in the Korean Peninsula. Tonight, we seek innovative solutions from the Canadian experts for lasting peace in the Korean Peninsula. I welcome you to join our conversation. 70 years, it is just a number for some, but it represents years of separation from millions of families in the Korean Peninsula since the Korean War in 1950. For Canadians who value family reunification, you'd truly understand the deep pain and sorrow the Korean families have had over such a long period of time. Canada has a long and deep friendship with Korea, starting with Dr. Frank Schofield, a Canadian missionary and educator who was a powerful voice for freedom and democracy in Korea during the Japanese occupation. In fact, he took up the cause of Korean independence with such passion that he is the only Westerner buried in the Patriots section of the National Cemetery in South Korea. With the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, Canada was one of the first countries who sent her troops to protect the freedom and democracy in the Korean Peninsula. After ceasefire in July 1953, the Korean Peninsula became a symbol of the Cold War between the then Soviet Union and the United States, which lasted for over 4 decades. Unfortunately, even after the Cold War ended with the Soviet Union's demise, along with the fall of the Berlin Wall, there is no declaration yet to end the Korean War, and there is no peace treaty to end the Korean conflict once for all. It is no wonder that the Korean War is often referred to as a forgotten war in our modern history. We are here today to explore and start searching for the ways to end the Korean War, the first step for the lasting peace. For that, we are seeking your perspective, a unique perspective from the world peace mediator, Canada, to help us with creative steps forward to end the current Korean conflict. It has been 70 years. Enough is enough. It's time to end the Korean War for good and enter into the lasting peace at the Korean Peninsula. Thank you for your continuous interest and friendship with Korea, and for your willingness to keep the legacy of Dr. Schofield for over the last 100 years. We look forward to continuing our friendship for another 100 years and more. Thank you. 감사합니다.
Thank you, Mr. Yeon-soo Kim. Now, I would like to share a video greeting from Chung Se-hyun, the Executive Vice Chair of NUAC in Korea.
토론토 협의회 자문위원 여러분, 그리고 캐나다 시민 여러분, 반갑습니다. 저는 민주평화통일자문회의 수석부의장 정세현입니다. 먼저 코로나19 상황에도 불구하고 한반도의 평화정착의 방향을 모색하기 위해서 평화통일 포럼을 개최하게 된 것을 진심으로 축하드리고 감사를 드립니다. 특히 이 행사를 준비하기 위해서 고생하신 김현수 토론토 지역협의회 회장님과 자문위원 여러분, 그동안 노고가 많으셨습니다. 거기에다가 이번 이 행사를 위해서 장소 제공 등 여러 가지 편의를 제공해 주신 장경용 주캐나다 한국대사관의 대사님, 다시 한번 감사를 드립니다. 그리고 오늘 행사에 토론자로 참여하신 장경영 대사님을 비롯해서 리커드 박사님, 에반스 교수님, 그리니우스 전 주한 캐나다 대사님, 미스터 와인가드너 교수님 패널로 참가해 주셔서 감사드립니다. 아시다시피 지난 유엔 총회 때 금년도 유엔 총회에서 문재인 대통령께서는 한반도 종전선언을 언급하셨습니다. 종전선언은 동북아의 평화를 가져오는, 또는 다른 표현을 한다면 동북아의 평화로 들어가는 입구이기 때문에 우리한테 굉장히 중요한 사안입니다. 그래서 오늘 회의에서 한반도 종전선언을 어떻게 이끌어낼 것인지 그 방법론에 대해서 심도 있는 논의를 좀 해주시기를 부탁드립니다. 또 하나 좀 우리 민주평통이 하고 있는 일 중에 중요한 일 하나가 있습니다. 2032년 올림픽을 서울 평양 공동올림픽으로 개최하기 위해서 민주평통이 노력을 해달라는 특별당부가 작년 9월 30일 민주평통 전체 회의에서 있었습니다. 문재인 대통령으로부터 바로 2032년 올림픽을 서울 평양 공동올림픽으로 만들기 위해서 우리가 무엇을 준비해야 되고 또 외국으로부터 무엇을 지원받아야 되는지에 대해서도 좀 더 구체적인 방법론을 이번 평화 포럼에서 좀 논의를 해주셨으면 좋겠습니다. 민주평통이 원래가 좋은 정책을 대통령께 건의하는 기능을 가지고 있기 때문에 저로서는 이번에 오타와에서 열리는 평화통일 포럼에서 종전선언 문제와 2032년 서울 평양 올림픽 공동 개최에 관련해서 아주 당장 쓸 수 있는 현실적인 대안들이 나오기를 좀 바랍니다. 그걸 가지고 제가 대통령께 건의 드릴 수 있도록 도와주시기 바랍니다. 다시 한번 오늘 행사를 축하드리면서 준비에 수고하신 김현수 회장님과 토론토 또는 캐나다의 자문위원 여러분, 특히 장경용 대사님께 다시 한번 감사 인사를 드립니다.
Many Canadian opinion leaders and decision makers have joined us today, including Senator Yona Martin, MP Nellie Shen, former Ambassador Len Edwards, former Senator Rose Wilson, Young-hae Lee from Canada-Korea Society. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time to introduce everyone. I ask for your understanding. This concludes the opening ceremony, and we are about to begin our main program. If you have any questions during the program, please use the chat box to submit your questions or send an email to nuac.canada.forum@gmail.com. Once again, nuac.canada.forum@gmail.com to submit your questions or use the chat box. Now I will call upon Dr. Dawn Rickerd, who will act as a moderator for our program today. Dawn practiced law in Toronto before moving to senior positions at York University in his earliest days. He was president of the Donor Canada Foundation of Toronto and the W.H. Donor Foundation, New York City. Currently, a senior research associate at Trinity College in the University of Toronto. Dawn has been very interested in the issues surrounding the Korean Peninsula for many years and has paid a number of visits to both the Republic of Korea and to the D.P.R.K. Dawn?
Thank you very much, Jay. Canada and Canadians have had a history of involvement with Korea over an extended period of time, commencing with the well-known missionary work by Canadians in the 19th century. This took the form not only of religious efforts, but it extended into the fields of teaching, medicine, and healthcare much more broadly. Then too came the sad events of the Japanese occupation and later the 1950 to 1953 Korean War, which cost the lives of several million Koreans, thousands of UN troops, including over 500 Canadians, and many thousands of Chinese, quote, volunteers. Now, even before the outbreak of war in 1950, the famous British military strategist, Captain Basil Liddell Hart, appears in a very well-known photo holding a globe. He has just been asked by a member of his audience where the most likely place was for a future outbreak of war, and he is pointing unmistakably to the Korean Peninsula. Indeed, for Canadians living today, it was the war itself that brought home what a flashpoint a divided peninsula was, and indeed it still is. Today, our Canadian educational institutions at all levels benefit greatly from the excellent, hardworking Korean and Korean Canadian students who enrich our classrooms to our mutual benefit. Both countries appreciate the great trade in automobiles, electronic goods, agricultural products, etc. And Korea has become Canada's 6th largest trading partner, and the dollar volume is increasing rapidly. Both parties have benefited greatly from the Canada-Korea Free Trade Agreement, which is now in its 6th year. There are many avenues through which Canada and Canadians can cooperate with both the Republic of Korea and potentially the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And I feel confident that at some later date, we will all be meeting to plan for future relationships between Canada and the entire Korean Peninsula, and not focusing on a tragic event that took place from 1950 to 1953, the consequences of which continue to affect us so many decades later. Now, we're delighted today to have as our special guest speaker, His Excellency, the Ambassador of the Republic of Korea to Canada, Mr. Chang Kyung-ryong. What an inspired choice the government of Korea made in appointing him to Ottawa, as he had taken his doctorate at McGill University in Montreal and then returned to Montreal 20 years later for a 2-year teaching fellowship. And Mr. Chang thus has a great head start over other ambassadors to Canada, few of whom, if any, have already lived in Canada and come to know so many Canadians. A political scientist, Mr. Chang taught at Hongjoo Women's University for his entire academic career. And he's developed a great interest in the complex issues surrounding the contrast between the theory and the practice of diplomacy, especially in this era of virtual relationships. Additionally, he is extremely interested in encouraging Canadian involvement in promoting better relations between the two Koreas. And this is an initiative of his that should find a ready response in Canada. And I might point out that all 3 of our panelists today have been visitors to or resided in both Koreas on multiple occasions. We are very fortunate in having the ambassador with us today as special guest speaker. Mr. Ambassador.
안녕하십니까. Good evening, everyone. Distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Before I begin, I would like to take this opportunity to thank President Yeon-soo Kim and Mr. Jieun of the Toronto chapter of the Korean National Unification Advisory Council for organizing this forum. I would like to extend my sincere appreciation to our three panelists, Dr. Paul Evans, Ambassador Marius Grinius, and Mr. Erich Weingartner, as well as the moderator for this evening panel discussion, Dr. Rickerd. Thank you, gentlemen, for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here with us tonight. You know, as we take stock over the past 67 years, we are confronted with an uneasy reality. The Korean War ended in a truce, not a peace treaty. The two Koreas are now farther apart than they ever were. Two vastly different societies with two opposing systems of governance. South Korea overcame the ravages of the war to develop into a progressive, prosperous country, a country that adheres to open, free market, democratic principles. North Korea, on the other hand, has remained closed and centralized. Over the years, various overtures have been made in the hopes of true reconciliation between North and South. But unfortunately, true reconciliation remains elusive. Yet, I remain adamant that hope is not lost. The South Korean government has not given up. It continues to put forward trust-building measures to lower the temperature on the DMZ. And with the continued support of our close allies, like Canada, which 7 years ago mobilized over 26,000 troops by land, sea, and air to fight alongside us. We believe that with genuine cooperation and partnership, we can make significant inroads and achieve a lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula. In pondering this evening's topic, why should Canada care? Can Canadians be persuaded to pay increased attention to the 70-year-old problem in the two Koreas? As an ambassador, I believe it would be prudent to let the expert panelists gathered here this evening debate on this particular issue. But in regard to the follow-up question, how might South Korea expect Canada to assist most effectively? I believe that in the past few years, recent Korea-Canada cooperation can attest to the fact that Canada is assisting South Korea in an effective and helpful manner on this very issue. Consider that in 2014, both Korea and Canada entered into a formal strategic partnership, a milestone achievement in relations. The goal of the partnership not only bolsters the Korea-Canada bilateral relationship, but more importantly, it strengthened our two countries' joint commitment to addressing challenging global issues. Every year, since the strategic partnership came into force, deputy ministers from Korea and Canada have taken part in the Korea-Canada strategic dialogue to exchange views on a whole host of global issues. And every year, delegates from Korea and Canada have taken part in the Seoul Defense Dialogue and the Halifax International Security Forum, enhancing critical information on the most pressing geopolitical matters of the day and further strengthening our bilateral security partnership. Our strategic partnership came into full view as the crisis over North Korea's nuclear weapons program escalated in 2016 and 2017. Canada, in conjunction with the United States, co-hosted in 2018 the Foreign Ministers meeting on security and stability on the Korean Peninsula in Vancouver. The meeting brought more than 20 foreign ministers together to discuss ways to implement and enforce UN sanctions that were introduced against North Korea in 2006 and strengthened in 2017. In addition to Canada's critical role in galvanizing international action to fully implement UN resolutions against the North Korean nuclear and the WMD programs, the government of Canada, under its commitment to regional security in the Asia Pacific, deployed military ships, aircraft, and personnel under Operation Neon to identify suspected maritime sanction evasion activities. This significant contribution to regional security in the Asia Pacific continues to strengthen the integrity of the global sanctions regime placed on North Korea and is most appreciated by the South Korean government. The growing closeness of the bilateral security relationship between Korea and Canada reached another milestone in May 2018, when Lieutenant General Weingartner became the first non-US officer to serve as Deputy Commander of the UN Command Korea. The Canadian Contingent United Command in Korea comprises 15 personnel who work tirelessly to formalize the relationship, enforce the 1953 Korean Armistice Agreement, and obtain, analyze, and share critical security-related information to partners in the region. Canada has historically stood shoulder to shoulder with South Korea in improving peace and security on the Korean Peninsula, whether it has been to facilitate inter-Korean dialogue or de-escalate tensions on the peninsula. Canada has always advocated for international action alongside South Korea. And for that, we will always remain deeply appreciative of Canada's efforts. In these unprecedented times, liberal democratic middle powers like Korea and Canada must continue to uphold and promote our shared goals and values through forums and multilateral institutions like the UN, G20, and APEC. We must continue to apply concerted pressure on the regime and foster greater cooperation among other nations if we are to see true, verifiable peace in the region. Despite the recent tragedies and setbacks to the peace process on the Korean Peninsula, the Republic of Korea will continue to actively support dialogue to enhance peace and stability in the region. We can achieve denuclearization and bring lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula with the international community's continued support and cooperation. Canada's support and cooperation has been and will continue to be significant in fostering peace and stability on the peninsula. It is my sincere hope that this forum will serve not only as a useful reminder as to the meaning of the Korean War, but also afford us the opportunity to re-examine the Korea-Canada bilateral relationship during this unprecedented and consequential time in recent memory. In so doing, I believe we can explore ways not only to contribute to peace on the Korean Peninsula, but as long-standing partners, uncover new ways to thrive in this new post-COVID world. Before I conclude, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to all of the Korean War veterans whom, in our darkest hour, sacrificed so much so that we could be free and reconstruct prosperous, liberal democracy. Though 70 years have passed, time has not diminished the memory of your noble actions from our hearts. Concerning today's topic, why should Canada care about the Korean Peninsula issue? I dare to answer it this way. The Canadian people have so much to cherish and be proud of as it relates to the Korean War veterans' sacrifice for peace on the peninsula. A hard-won peace, an armistice, was the result of the Canadian people's brave efforts so many generations ago. But as we confront new challenges, Canada, as an Asia-Pacific country, has to actively cooperate with the Korean government in the long-standing process of enhancing permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula. Canada's value of human rights, peace and security, and diplomacy are also Korea's values. And if we stand by each other together as middle powers, we will be stronger for it. Once again, I would like to extend my appreciation to the Toronto chapter of the Korean National Unification Advisory Council for organizing this evening's Korean Peace Forum. I look forward to a lively and enlightened discussion on this most important topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for that very thoughtful speech. And we appreciate greatly your request to Canadians to participate in the ongoing relationships between our countries. I owe Paul Evans, a professor at the University of British Columbia, a sincere vote of thanks for having introduced me to the Koreas and to Korean studies by including me in a 3-person group on a 1-week trip to the D.P.R.K. almost 25 years ago. That was a time when visitors to the D.P.R.K. were few and far between. The great leader had just died, and his son, Kim Jong-il, had just taken over. I found that visit and our many meetings with D.P.R.K. officials to be fascinating, and I have expanded my interest and contacts with the 2 Koreas ever since that time. So I say thank you, Paul. Paul received his PhD from Dalhousie University in Halifax and has devoted himself subsequently to Asian studies at, amongst others, Acadia, York, Harvard, and the University of Hong Kong, where he has taught and conducted research on Asian matters and published widely. While at York, he also served a 5-year term as director of the University of Toronto, York Joint Center for Asia-Pacific Studies. And he is one of the most distinguished Asian experts in Canada, and notes that he has arranged 24 meetings involving participants from North Korea. Paul has played a vital role in the development of Canadians' understanding of the Koreas and of Asia generally. His work has extended well beyond the academic, especially when the University of British Columbia released him from his academic responsibilities for 3 years to serve as the co-CEO of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. Paul Evans, speaking to us from Vancouver. Paul.
Thank you, Don. Is my voice now coming through loud and clear?
I can hear you now.
We can hear me.
Yep.
Good. Dawn, thank you very, very much for that kind introduction. It was the kind of words that my father would have appreciated and my mother would have believed. It's a very, very kind tribute. And to thank Jay Chung and his colleagues who have worked long and hard to put this session together under the complex circumstances that we're all living in, with distance and social distancing being the necessary parts of the way we communicate. It is a real pleasure to be part of this discussion, in part because it brings together 3 of us, Erich Weingartner, myself, and Marius Grinius, who have had an abiding interest in Korean affairs and have been part of what I might call the chorus, along with Don Rickerd and several others in the country, for trying to see our relationship with the Korean Peninsula as of course, including South Korea, the Republic of Korea, but also our Korean Peninsula includes North Korea, the D.P.R.K. as well. As difficult, as complicated, as frustrating as that effort might be, I think there is a strong and persistent voice in Canada, though not always the dominant voice, for a walking on 2 legs strategy in our approach to understanding Korean Peninsula tensions and the issues around it. Well, I'm speaking to you from Vancouver this afternoon, and outside my window, it is dark, overcast, the wind is blowing, there is rain falling, and it's one of those drear Vancouver days. And in some ways, it makes me think of the moment that we are all living in now, in an unusually turbulent period in global affairs. A period of COVID and immense suffering and difficulties for many peoples around the world, for some of our families, and for our nations. It's also a time of storm in the context of great power relations, and particularly the United States and China, that in the last 4 years have moved deeper and deeper down a path towards strategic competition, rivalry, and adversary relations. But it's also been a bit of a dark and stormy time in the context of our international organizations, where there is a fraying commitment to multilateralism and international cooperation that, unfortunately, COVID has done more to reinforce those tensions than to produce pathways to deeper international cooperation. And I think too that it's a dark and stormy period in the context of what is going on in many of our democracies around the world. New challenges of populism, extremism that shake long cherished institutions. Democracy is a precious, precious commodity, as South Korea has discovered in its journey. And I think we're all now in a period where our democracies are also under new kinds of pressures and threats that we haven't seen this combination of stormy settings at the international, among great powers, international institutions, and in our democratic institutions at home. The fear is that we are, if not in, at least re-entering a period of Cold War, and even more distressing, that we may be entering a period, a historical period, reminiscent of the 1930s. We have a great deal of work to do to avoid echoing and repeating the mistakes of that dreadful decade. In that context, a strange comment that developments on the Korean Peninsula, while disturbing from time to time, as big difficulties have been very apparent, it's comparatively calmer than the world around it. And as we've known at an earlier stage, the Korean Peninsula conflict can generate conflict in a region, but it also can be reinforced by great power competition around the Korean Peninsula. And it's in that context that we look at an increasingly assertive and repressive China under Xi Jinping that we have seen in the last few years, an erratic and conflicted United States under Donald Trump, and an interaction that is a spiral towards something that some call a new Cold War, but that I think we might more accurately define as a deep strategic confrontation between the two countries. As we're looking forward to, as we're kind of trying to scope what is the context of the Canadian relationship with the Korean Peninsula, and particularly with North Korea, where I think today we can focus some attention. Fairly obvious why we care about our relationship with South Korea, but it's why we should care about a relationship with North Korea as well. That will be very much on our agenda today. And it is, we do it at a time, dark clouds, but also at a time of uncertainty. As we are thinking through what a Canadian strategy and approach should be, we're all watching with a great deal of attention Donald Trump's latter weeks or months as American president. And the possibility, as seems to be happening on some other fronts, of some rash actions by an American president in his last few months. It's unusual, but it is something we need to watch very carefully. We also are concerned about this awkward time from the perspective of what North Korea might or might not do to send messages to an incoming American president. We hope they could be love letters, but more, they could also take the form of missile or nuclear tests. So it's a sensitive moment as we're looking because of that transition in the United States and because of that conflict between the United States and China. Ultimately, both of those countries are going to be essential parts of the package that allow a unification of the Korean Peninsula after a period of cessation of hostilities. The United States and China in the latter days of the Trump administration have not been able to agree on very much. And whether it's the big global issues like climate change and regional conflicts, including the Korean Peninsula, a US-China understanding, or at least appreciation of the positions of each other and the two Koreas is going to be essential. Now, that brings us to an issue that Canadians are, like South Koreans and like everyone around the world, is wrestling with, is what might a Biden administration do differently? Well, in some ways, my view is that a Biden presidency can come with certain openness about possibilities that other incoming presidents have not had to face, have had to face provocations from North Korea prior to their coming in. Let's hope that doesn't happen. And if so, what would we expect from a Biden administration? Well, we're not sure. We know that Donald Trump's approach, which had a heavy emphasis on summit diplomacy and personal relations with North Korea's leader, did not produce substantial results. We know that Donald Trump's administration's efforts to bypass human rights issues in North Korea did not produce any substantial progress on human rights fronts. And we know that the effort to try to reduce tensions unilaterally have not been fully successful. The six-party talks or equivalents and others weren't part of that arsenal. Well, I think that Mr. Biden has the opportunity to revisit some of the things from the past that we need to go back to. And one of those is going to be the sequencing of North Korean arms control, disarmament. I think he has the opportunity, as difficult as it may be to sell domestically, to look at the possibility of understanding North Korea as a nuclear state in the context of then trying to insist on and work with the global community in tightening the restrictions, the limitations. Complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement is not going to come before there is a step-by-step sequenced approach. And there's a possibility of the Biden administration having room, at least at the executive level, to move on those fronts. Well, the other thing that is rather different in this period is what will China do with respect to Korean Peninsula issues. And at this stage, during the COVID crisis, the pandemic, there have been certain restrictions on border trade, things moving back and forth. But it is clear that China sees itself as having a determinate role in what unfolds, that its improvement of its bilateral relations with North Korea in the last 3 years is given it, if perhaps some leverage. We have to explore that. But we're going to have to explore that with China in the context of a joint effort rather than in a confrontation with China on multiple fronts. Let me conclude with a couple of thoughts for the group, because we have two of our best thinkers and most active people in connecting, Canadians, in connecting with North Korea, who will be following me. But that one of the reasons we have not had a great deal of Canadian attention in the media and the public on North Korea is we haven't had bandwidth for consideration beyond COVID, but particularly beyond our own China difficulties. The problems around the our two Michaels, Madam Meng, and a series of other difficulties with China bilaterally in the last 2 years have sucked a lot of the oxygen out of our creative diplomatic thinkers on what can be done specifically with North Korea as a huge and looming challenge. And that in Ottawa, my sense is that our government has been largely preparing for multiple possibilities. Ambassador Chung made an important reference to the meetings here that our Foreign Minister Freeland and Secretary of State Tillerson held in Vancouver a couple of years ago, a little more than 2 years. Those meetings were built around bringing more coordination around maximum pressure and the sanctions program against North Korea. The ambassador also spoke to Canadian involvement subsequently in some of the naval and other military and intelligence operations to secure those pressures. As I look forward, and as Ottawa looks forward, there's the other half of the picture. And that picture is not just the pressure and the sanctions, the push against North Korea, the signaling of our worries about North Korean positions on the nuclear and missile questions in particular. But the other half of it is what we can do to try to keep open a few of the windows that we have. We don't have any big doors, but we do have some open, if small, windows into North Korea. Some of those have been through our humanitarian operations, which are at a very low level at this point, but still important. People like Susan Ritchie and First Steps have managed through all of the storm, the controversy, and the difficulties, been able to keep just one small window open. Unfortunately, on the Track 2 activities that some of us were involved with for many years, in the educational exchanges we've had with North Korea, they are on hold, they are on hold. Not necessarily because of lack of political support or interest, but because of COVID. This is a new era, and we haven't yet found a way to connect with our colleagues in the D.P.R.K. through the means we're using today. We're not quite there. But nevertheless, the idea of keeping those alive when the time is right is so, so important. And the best we can do at this stage is the constant reminder that the path to peace will involve some coercive measures. It will involve sanctions, but it's ultimately going to depend on how we can help open North Korea to the outside world. And Canada, in that perspective, from that perspective, since 1990, has been very active in trying to open up those windows and keep them open. So with that, how we're going to do this in a story in time, how we're going to do it in a context of conflict, or at least deep strategic competition between the United States and China, how we're going to navigate through our big relations, We draw heart in what Ambassador Hwang said about how important our coordination with South Korea is in this. Len Edwards and others who've been running the Canada-Korea Forum can really speak to it better, but we have kept those channels open, and they will be in partnership with South Korea. But our special advantage is how we can do a form of engagement with a place to the north that is pretty difficult to operate in. So with that, thank you, Don, and look forward to the panel, the conversation, the questions to follow.
Thank you very much, Paul. You've given us a lot of points to think about, and I hope some of the discussion later will focus on the points that you've raised today. Now, our next panelist is Mr. Marius Grinius, the former Canadian ambassador who is accredited to both the Republic of Korea and to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Marius is a graduate of the Royal Military College in Kingston, and he served in the Canadian Army for 12 years before joining the Foreign Service in 1989. Now, his postings were to extremely interesting and important parts of the world, including as ambassador to Vietnam, as well as to the two Koreas, as I noted earlier. And he served in several senior positions in the security and intelligence fields, as well as being appointed our ambassador and permanent representative to the UN in Geneva and the Conference on Disarmament. His posting to Seoul occurred in 2004, and the accreditation to Pyongyang was in 2005. At the time, his D.P.R.K. counterpart accredited to Canada was the D.P.R.K. ambassador to the UN in New York. And he spent very little time in Canada, although he did visit the University of Toronto on one occasion and delivered both a lecture and a seminar at the Monk School. Now, Canada later broke off diplomatic ties with the D.P.R.K., and I hope Marius will have time today to comment on the desirability or otherwise of our re-engaging with Pyongyang, even though discussions between the two countries have been conducted on a very confidential basis that only recently became public. At the present time, Marius lives in Ottawa. He's a fellow of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, and he's much in demand as a speaker and participant at various conferences and university events. I would not want to miss this opportunity to point out that Marius has devoted 45 years of his life to service for the government of Canada, and thus for both you and me. Marius?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Don, for this, for your wonderful introduction, and certainly thank you for the organizers of this webinar, an important step, I think, in trying to think things through. First of all, of course, I would agree with everything that Paul has said, and will continue to, I think. Let me begin, however, by doing full disclosure. Number one, I do believe that there is a new great game being played out by an ascendant China with global ambitions, assisted by junior partner Russia, and against a United States that I think is in strategic retreat. And these have important implications for the Korean Peninsula, as Paul has already mentioned. Number two, I do remain in that group of North Korea watchers who really do not believe that Kim Jong-un is going to negotiate away his nuclear weapons. It's all about regime survival and all of that. And number three, I do believe that the road for any progress towards peace on the Korean Peninsula lies more with China and Beijing than it does with Washington, although we'll see how Biden, of course, handles the situation. China, I do believe, has to decide whether to recognize North Korea as a full-fledged nuclear weapon state. We'll see. In terms of Canada and the Koreas, I think it is in Canada's interest to do more with respect to the entire Korean Peninsula. I think Canada's already has a very, very strong relationship with South Korea, cemented in blood during the Korean War, but always constantly being enhanced, whether you talk about the free trade agreement, the strategic partnership between our two countries, membership in UN Command, or like-minded cooperation on issues around arms control, disarmament, nuclear non-proliferation. And outside of war, Canada's relationship with North Korea really began with Canada's support for President Kim Dae-jung's Sunshine Policy engagement towards North Korea. And of course, we did quite a bit of humanitarian work at the same time, which I think Erich will talk to. Canada's engagement policy, though, was with North Korea, however, was reversed by the Harper government in 2010, when that government decided that its policy of controlled engagement would be the way forward. And I think perhaps even ideology played into that kind of decision. Anyway, we ended up with continuing, of course, to support UN sanctions, but limiting diplomatic engagement mostly to consular issues. And of course, now we're at that point of 6 North Korean nuclear tests and dozens of missile tests, short range, that concern particularly South Korea, medium range that concern Japan, and long range that concern the United States. Now, Canada has tried to up its game, and already there was mention of more US or Canadian forces being deployed to UN Command, and the occasional naval ship that looks into the entire UN sanctions issue. It would actually be interesting to find out what Department of National Defense thinks about what it has observed in terms of sanctions. But in general, of course, we're trying to, I believe the government of Canada is trying to move from its kind of position of being marginalized on North Korean issues to trying to be a player. And Global Affairs Canada, of course, established in 2018 the North Korea Task Force, quote, to contribute to a more stable, secure environment on the Korean Peninsula. And of course, as Don mentioned, there was a reference recently in the media about reports that there were clandestine meetings between North Korean and Canadian officials in 2018, and that there may have been a plan for enhanced diplomatic engagement with North Korea again, fairly recently, but it seems like not much has happened in that area. But I would really encourage further efforts in that direction. Canada should, through engagement with North Korea, really help solve one of the world's greatest security challenges that are out there, and use it as an important building block in terms of Canada's long-term political, economic, and security commitment to Asia. And I think engagement with Pyongyang means a number of things. And as Paul suggested, I think we have to open up a few more windows. First of all, Canada does have to reestablish its credibility and expertise in terms of North Korea. Canada cannot simply rely on others to tell us what is actually happening in North Korea. We have to see it for ourselves. And that means higher, closer diplomatic relations. It means regular engagement by our ambassador to Seoul, who is still not accredited to Pyongyang, plus senior Canadian officials who are able to convey Canadian concerns directly to senior North Korean cadres in North Korea. And it's that dialogue on issues such as nuclear proliferation, human rights, cyberspace, regional security that should be the regular kind of discussion that we should have. And this is the only way I think that we can, Canada as a player, could get greater credibility and expertise back in terms of knowing what's happening with North Korea and contributing, hopefully, to the solution. Canada also has to be prepared to help future North Korean humanitarian challenges, which we would know better if we actually saw what was happening. Of course, our relationship with South Korea means continuing to support South Korean efforts in that direction, but it would also mean that we would be able to talk to some of the other major players, China, United States, Russia, Japan, with more credibility. Ultimately, I think that Canada has to be prepared to provide wise counsel and support in the quest for a peaceful Korean unification. And in this context, Canada, as a member of UN Command, would have to be well informed in terms of the types of positions what a peace treaty, a peace declaration, and potentially a peace treaty would look like. Chinese-US relations, whether US troops would stay on the peninsula if there is a treaty, what to do about a potential refugee tsunami out of North Korea towards China and towards South Korea, and of course what to do with ultimately with North Korea's military and its nuclear and chemical weapons, and possibly even biological ones. When unification eventually does occur, I think Canada, along with others, should be in a good position to offer the type of expert help in areas such as health, agriculture, human rights, good governance, all the good things that would make a unified Korea a viable entity. Bottom line, re-engagement with North Korea as a policy priority would be an important building block in Canada's political, security, and economic commitments to Asia, something that we have not really been consistent in demonstrating to our Asian friends. And most important in the short term is working closely with our friends and allies, including South Korea and the United States. Thank you very much, Don.
Thank you, Marius. That was very interesting, and we'd like to come back to a number of the points that you've raised. Now, our third panelist is Erich Weingartner, whose involvement with Korea dates back to 1978, when he was the executive secretary of the Commission of the Churches on International Affairs, with special responsibility for the World Council of Churches Human Rights Program. Erich is a graduate of both McMaster and the Waterloo Lutheran Seminary. Now, in 1979, Korean churches asked the World Council of Churches to make contact with the D.P.R.K. And in 1985, Erich paid his first visit to the D.P.R.K. and he secured permission for a meeting of North and South Korean delegations to meet in Switzerland. This probably was the first face-to-face meeting of the two Koreas since 1953. And it was followed by a series of 3 additional such meetings. Very bravely, Erich, his wife, and younger daughter moved to Pyongyang in 1997 for a 2-year posting with the UN World Food Program. This was a period of great difficulties with famine conditions, bringing many citizens to starvation. Erich has visited all provinces of the D.P.R.K., and this is no mean feat for a foreigner. Erich was the longtime editor of CanKor, a publication on current news from the D.P.R.K. And when it ceased publication, many of us were deprived of a scrupulously honest, well-written, and informative source of information on the D.P.R.K. I miss it greatly, Erich, and I know many others do too. Now call upon Erich Weingartner.
Thank you so much, Don. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation by the National Advisory Council to be part of this, this panel. I'm especially happy that these colleagues here have all crossed paths with me on numerous occasions. I remember, of course, in the year 2000, Senator Lois Wilson led a parliamentary delegation to North Korea, and Paul Evans and I were on that delegation and had a very good visit there. I had another opportunity to have a visit to North Korea with Don Rickerd, and we had some fun there as well. Not only fun, but also some aggravation. I think it's the first time I've seen Don really angry at one point. But also later, I had the possibility of a visit to North Korea with my daughter, Miranda. And when we came back, we passed by Seoul. And at that time, Ambassador Marius Grinius was our ambassador in Seoul. And he invited us to a dinner with a number of notables from South Korea. Among them was the current, or I think he just the previous past president of the Red Cross Society in South Korea, who also was a colleague of mine in the World Council of Churches previously. So we are, I think, a small group of people, of Canadians who have followed with great interest the goings-on the Korean Peninsula, and especially relations with North Korea and the various difficulties that have already been pointed out. My topic was to speak about the relevance of humanitarian aid to the peace issue. And it just so happened that this year, the 2020 Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to the World Food Program, the largest specialized agency of the United Nations. And in justifying this award, the Norwegian Nobel Committee stated the following: the World Food Program plays a key role in multilateral cooperation on making food security an instrument of peace, and has made a strong contribution toward mobilizing UN member states to combat the use of hunger as a weapon of war and conflict. Now, having had the privilege of working with the WFP for some years ago, I feel this is a well-deserved honor. And I do believe that humanitarian aid should, in principle, be an instrument of peace, or at least be able to have a peace-building impact. In practice, unfortunately, this is far from self-evident. North Korea is a case in point. The World Food Program has been operating there uninterrupted for the past 25 years. During the famine of the late 1990s, North Korea became the largest aid operation in the WFP's history. And Canada played its part by channeling designated funds via the WFP, but also through matching grants via Canadian NGOs, like, for example, the Canadian Food Grains Bank, which should have the largest inputs into North Korea among the Canadian NGOs. But we should also realize that countries like the United States have also contributed huge amounts of dollars to humanitarian aid to North Korea, some $700 million within the space of 10 years. And most of that was channeled through the World Food Program. Now, if humanitarian aid is really an instrument of peace, does it follow that the massive input of US aid was meant to contribute to peace on the Korean Peninsula? That was not the perception of most observers during the time that I worked at the WFP in Pyongyang. Our local North Korean counterparts appreciated the food, but certainly did not trust us. The fact that so much of our operation was financed by the USA aroused tremendous suspicions about political motives. And they were not alone. A lot of criticism came from other aid workers, especially those employed by the European Community Humanitarian Office, who regarded us simply as unwitting agents of US policies. And they said so on numerous occasions. Another Nobel laureate who was also working in Pyongyang during that time decided to leave North Korea in 1998 after only a year there. Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders, concluded that access to beneficiaries was too restrictive to carry out meaningful humanitarian work. They even called on the international community to stop delivering aid to North Korea. And a year later, in 1999, they received the Nobel Peace Prize. Humanitarian aid can certainly be used to promote peaceful ends. But agencies are dependent on their donors, not just financially, but also politically. This is especially obvious in the case of North Korea, where the major humanitarian donors are almost exclusively perceived as enemies of the regime. If you look at a chart of aid flows to North Korea during the past 25 years, it becomes obvious that the amount of aid is less dependent on actual needs than on the interests that dictate policies in Seoul or in Washington or in Canada for that matter. It has been 75 years since the division of Korea at the end of World War II. It's been 70 years since the start of the Korean War. And I have personally been involved with Korea for half of that time. I am by nature and conviction an optimistic person. But I have found that it takes a lot more effort to be optimistic than to be pessimistic. My optimism has suffered as much from the aging process as my arthritic joints. We live in an age of extreme polarization. Polarization has paralyzed both domestic and international action on the most pressing problems of civilization. We need look no farther than south of our own border. Polarization has been imprinted onto the Korean Peninsula by the very act of division 75 years ago. Those of us who grew up during the Cold War have had polarization imprinted on our psychology. Dualism has become part of our thought process. It is always either or, never both and. It is always winning or losing, never compromising or finding win-win strategies. Polarization stifles creativity because it makes us uncomfortable to repeat the same cycles. It makes us comfortable, it makes us comfortable repeating the same cycles again and again, all the while hoping for different outcomes. And that is, in fact, a popular definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over, but expecting different results. Most of all, I think polarization becomes so destructive because it is based on emotional fixation rather than rational flexibility. We harness emotions to elicit thinking and action. And emotions can be manipulated. This is the methodology of every propaganda, every advertisement, every fundraising drive. It is how we can win converts to our cause. Now, of course, emotions are perfectly normal. They're healthy. Healthy emotions make life worth living. But emotions can also become dysfunctional, leading to destructive thought processes and inappropriate or harmful behavior. Every sort of mental illness can be described as emotional instability. Emotions run amok, out of control. Now, I think those of us who have ever visited North Korea know that it's very hard not to have extreme emotional reactions to North Korea. It is rare to find a news report or article or book or learned paper about the D.P.R.K. that does not arouse an emotional reaction. If you have ever visited or even lived in North Korea, you're bound to have experienced strong emotions, maybe even culture shock. I have witnessed experienced battle-hardened aid workers suffer nervous breakdowns in North Korea. When participating in events like this one today, and I have participated in quite a number, I often wonder whether, in addition to professors of political science, diplomats, theologians, and humanitarian aid workers, we ought to have invited mental health professionals as part of the speaker panel. They might have taught us something about cognitive behavior therapy. CBT is based on the notion that emotions, thought processes, and behavior form an interrelated triangle. If you have ever had a temper outburst, you know that our feelings can affect how we think and act. Thinking, cognition, our belief systems, our worldviews, our ideologies, they can have a powerful impact not only on our actions, but also on our emotions. Anyone who has ever been involved with Alcoholics Anonymous has probably heard the term stinking thinking. Obsessive rumination can intensify addictive behavior. And if both our emotions and our thinking have escaped our control, there is a way to change things. We can decide to change our behavior. By behaving in a different way, we have a chance to change both our thinking and our emotional responses. So does this have any importance? Does it make any sense in relation to Canada's foreign policy? Perhaps not. After all, it is the task of any government to base decisions on Canadian interests, not emotions. On the other hand, every politician has to pay careful attention to the mood of the electorate. I would guess that the vast majority of Canadians are in favor of peace, human rights, and humanitarian aid. But the complexity of these issues as applied to Korea are largely unknown, except to smaller constituencies with special interests in Korea, like the people that are here and probably also those that are listening to us. As a result, Canada has generally opted simply to follow the lead dictated by Washington, alternately supplying humanitarian aid, supporting human rights resolutions, expressing outrage about nuclear weapons developments, and applying sanctions. Sanctions in particular have had a devastating negative impact on humanitarian aid to North Korea, which has shrunk to a mere trickle. Larger NGOs like the Canadian Food Grains Bank have entirely ceased their involvement. Smaller faith-based organizations that do not rely on government donations have continued humanitarian assistance at a moderate level. Already First Steps has been mentioned, based in Vancouver. The Mennonite Central Committee, which is a binational church-related organization, they still try to operate humanitarian aid to North Korea and in North Korea. They sometimes partner with an American NGO called Christian Friends of Korea. And of course, as we have already noted, this year, the COVID-19 lockdown in D.P.R.K. has added even more complications and delays as far as humanitarian aid is concerned. So if I am to assess my own state of mind, I must confess that my primary emotion is one of disappointment. After more than 30 years of involvement with the Korean conundrum, pursuing constructive relationships, preaching reconciliation, and advocating peace in a variety of roles, I'm beginning to wonder whether I am being delusional. Am I doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results? Still, I have not yet succumbed to complete despair, and I will tell you why. There is a younger, more diverse, more creative, more energetic post-Cold War generation, which is unfortunately not represented on this panel. That generation is beginning to flex its muscles both here in Canada and internationally. Some of the most active and innovative of these are women who have become tired of the belligerent male-dominated ideologues that operate only on the basis of military power and coercive diplomacy. I'm thinking here especially about the movements such as Women Cross DMZ, whose members include women Nobel laureates. I'm thinking of organizations like the Nobel Women's Initiative, the Women's Forum for Peace and Diplomacy, Korea Peace Now, the Korean Women's Movement for Peace, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the United Church of Canada, and female staff of numerous NGOs and organizations like the Red Cross. The United Church of Canada has been at work organizing a women's peace conference that they wish to host in Canada. Women's delegations from both North and South Korea are expected to participate. The only impediments to this conference are the ongoing sanctions and the current pandemic. I should also note that one of my former employers, the World Council of Churches, has revived an active campaign for peace and reconciliation on the Korean Peninsula, focusing especially on direct relationships with North Korean Christian counterparts. And I invite you to check out their campaign for prayers for peace and reconciliation in Korea that they've launched in this year. You can download their new publication, which is entitled The Light of Peace, Churches in Solidarity with the Korean Peninsula. It's a 200-page book of prayers and peace testimonies that was published in September just this year. I will close by mentioning one other aspect of cognitive behavioral therapy that particularly comforts me. In traditional psychotherapy, it was assumed that the best road forward toward mental health was to return back to one's traumas of yesteryear in order to overcome their negative effects. In contrast, CBT focuses on the present. We are encouraged to deal only with what is happening right now because it is impossible to change the past. Hope lies in the future, not the past. And it's my hope and prayer that the coming generation can do a better job of making peace than my generation has managed to do. So thank you for inviting me to speak, and thank you for listening to me. I am now considered one of the old men with disjointed thoughts. So I give it back to you, Don.
Thank you very much, Erich. You've given us a lot of food for thought, and we'll come back to some of those points in a few minutes. Now, we've divided our remaining limited time into two sections. The first is panel discussion, so that you can ask your fellow panelists to expand on their points, or you can contradict them, or you can agree with them. And then we'll proceed to take some questions, and hopefully the three panelists will provide us with some answers. So let's start off on the panelists. Who has some questions for fellow panelists? Paul?
Thank you, Don, and thank you for the presentations. I think all of us are just a wee bit crazy to throw ourselves into this issue for 25 or 35 years. This is one of the more intractable set of issues that we've ever encountered. We thought engagement with China was difficult. We thought that engagement with Vietnam was difficult, and even Myanmar. North Korea is a supreme test. But I wanted to come back to Marius on a question he and I have general agreement on, but there may be some fine tuning that we should explore. And that's the relationship between Beijing and Pyongyang. And I would say that one of the things that struck me about the anniversaries of the end of the Korean War that Xi Jinping has emphasized in speeches recently and a kind of portrait of that war in a very special way as a almost reviving the kind of closer relationship with North Korea that had been slipping for several years. All of our trips to Beijing in recent, at least until the last 6 months or 8 months, our Chinese friends would talk about how despairing they were of their inability to pressure North Korea on the nuclear question. I'm wondering if, though we're now in a period where, for the very reasons you outlined, the great power competition, that Beijing may be reassessing that punitive twist the arm of North Korea relationship in favor of offering it a new long-term relationship, maybe not an alliance, but something pretty close to it. This is hanging in the balance, and I wonder what you think about it.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. I have been thinking about it for quite some time, and actually when I would pass through Beijing en route to Pyongyang, I would have regular meetings, not only with the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but also with various Chinese think tanks that I'm sure you're also familiar with, party, military, and foreign affairs. What struck me, and also with talking with the Chinese in my day, 2 ambassadors about the influence of China on North Korean activity, and it was really interesting when most said, we, the Chinese, do not have as much influence on North Korea as you think we do. Yeah, they turned off oil at one point, 15 years ago or so. I do think that China is playing an interesting game in that global context of competition with the United States. I actually thought, hey, for China, China strategic thinker ought to be looking at a unified Korea as a much better outcome than a North Korea that was a liability. And you will recall that Xi Jinping met with the previous Park Geun-hye president before he even thought about doing anything with North Korea. I get this impression right now that that game can continue because it's in China's interest in the context of the United States more than anything else. But I'm starting to get this impression that as hard of a nut as North Korea is, the fact that Kim Jong-un, how many times did he come to visit Xi Jinping, is kind of almost portraying itself as a vassal state right now to China. But we'll see how that plays out. I mean, there aren't any answers, and I couldn't even make a prediction. But I get that sense, as I said, China has to make up its mind whether it will accept North Korea as a nuclear weapons state. If not, then the game becomes much more difficult, and China has to talk to the United States then, as well as Japan and South Korea, maybe even Russia, in order to see what else can be done.
It's unfortunate that the panelists were not picked tonight on the basis of age, as I might have made the big team tonight. But I want to just try out one idea. Recently, I was asked to address a group in Toronto, and in preparing my remarks, I jotted down some what I would call people-to-people points that I thought were of interest. And I was quite surprised by the time I gave my address I had collected 26 different signals from the D.P.R.K. that I interpreted as requests or suggestions for people-to-people exchanges. They ranged from obscure topics to a group of pilots from Ohio who went to North Korea to look at vintage airplanes, a surfer who went from California to North Korea to give advice on surfing possibilities. And some of you may have read the remarkable article recently on the so-called hockey team from, I think, Minneapolis that went. It was from one of the beer leagues. The goaltender was 74 years old. And the most remarkable thing happened. They lost 16-0 on the opening game. And after the game, the North Korean captain came into the dressing room and suggested that for the next night, they go back to schoolboy practices, and that is each captain picked a player from one team or the other. And there have been quite a number of things of that nature. Indeed, every year on my birthday, I get an email from the D.P.R.K. congratulating me on achieving another year. And frequently, including a couple of days ago, the suggestion was made that more people-to-people exchanges should be conducted. Would we waste our time diverting to a lot of different things of that nature, or are these solid things that could make a great contribution? Erich, you're the one who lived there.
Yes, I would love to jump in at this suggestion. I think it's something that I've been promoting for years and years. And I was happy that Marius also mentioned the idea that we've got to be in touch with these people. We have to find connections wherever they might happen. I mean, the diplomatic level is one level, the humanitarian level is another. World Council of Churches dealing with Christian communities in North Korea is another. And I think we should multiply these. Also, in terms of humanitarian aid, there are different things that are being done and have been done. It's not just food aid. There's been a lot of work in terms of agriculture and actually teaching North Korean at the various levels on the farms themselves, but also in the academies of agriculture, different methods of doing things in order to increase food security. Some of the organizations that work with people of disabilities have done a fantastic job in North Korea and have been able to even to help North Koreans change laws about how people with disabilities should be treated and what kind of rights they should have. I think there's a lot of this kind of thing that is possible. And I think more space should be provided. I think Canada is one of those countries that is, okay, we're friends with the USA, but we're still considered one step removed, who could do a lot more in this area. And that's one of the things I'm very sad about, that we are not more involved. The sports area is one. We've had, of course, people from North Korea coming as students to UBC, but not only that, there have been agricultural groups that have come to Canada to look how things are done in Canada and have been shown around and have had discussions. And a lot of this is really the people-to-people angle. We need to understand more what people think in North Korea. And of course, we have a whole community of refugees from North Korea, defectors, and they can teach us a lot about what is going on there. but often we concentrate too much on all the negatives and don't learn more about everyday life in North Korea and how people think in general in North Korea. And we can only do that if we have as much as possible people-to-people exchanges.
If I can just add to that, when I first arrived in Pyongyang, I had these flashbacks to my first work in Hanoi, which hit a time that was pretty dark and miserable. But one of the best and most successful programs that CEDA had was encouraging the Vietnamese to send their people in various delegations, but also as students to Canada to really be part of that people-to-people connection. And but the difference between Vietnam of that time and North Korea even now, I believe, is that there was much more information among ordinary Vietnamese about the outside world. North Korea, it's starting, and I believe the biggest weapon, if you like, is that memory stick that gives a glance of for North Koreans in terms of the outside world, and knowledge of the outside world is important in whatever way it can be done, but again, both officially and unofficially. Thank you.
Paul, have you any comments on that?
I do, and it's from the perspective of people-to-people activities are almost like they make a great deal of sense from a lot of angles. People who have become involved in them often enjoy them, but they are hard to sustain and organize in a context when there are tight political problems. Remember when we opened our negotiations with North Korea for diplomatic exchange, for diplomatic relations, where others were trying to get some leverage around the nuclear question or the missile problem. This is back in 2000. The Canadian effort was to secure mechanisms for access into North Korea. Some of that would be ultimately diplomatic posting, but we wanted to be able to follow where our humanitarian assistance went. We wanted to open educational programs. We talked about sporting events and other things as part of that agenda. And it was something that our minister, Axworthy, thought was important. Our conservative colleagues, everyone said, let's go with this side of things. It hasn't materialized on a very large scale. We've tried basketball diplomacy. We did ice hockey exchanges with goaltenders and other things too. Civil society groups promoted those and pushed them themselves. Right now, it's first impossible to do these things with North Korea because of the COVID. The people-to-people angle is extraordinarily difficult. Borders are sealed even in deeper ways, is at least my impression. But also there seems to be some fatigue or a lack of push from the bottom up on these matters. Not just because Dennis Rodman maybe put a blemish on the whole game of sporting diplomacy. But to go back to the ambassador's original question, what do we do to get Canadians engaged in this? I think we have to start from the premise that there is not now an enormous appetite for them. And on the educational side, which we would like to do, we find that our educational exchanges with North Korea maybe open windows, minds, ideas that we can't see, but to measure them, to try to say to a university official, why would you do this? Why would we put resources in a post-COVID setting? We're going to have to come up with some ways of indicating success. And I turn that back to Erich, because no one has spent more of their life trying to figure out if they are making an impact. How do we see it? Do we have to see it or feel it to know we're making a difference? Because as he put it, many of the people who have been on the front line of this enterprise have had nervous breakdowns, have broken down. This is a tough nut. Erich, how do we know if we're having success, and how can we enthuse Canadians at least about the possibility?
I don't know how to answer that question. You've just pointed out what makes it so difficult. I don't think we can go with the usual, what is it, the methodology of deciding what should be the outcome and noting down indicators of success. I think in this situation, it's practically impossible. I'm often asked, why is it that so many faith-based organizations are working in North Korea? And it's because faith-based organizations don't require the indicators, or shall I say, the guarantee of success. They don't require it. They do it on faith. They know that it somehow is going to work its wonders without having to take a magnifying glass and seeing and counting it and indicating it and making check marks on a list. Like we had check marks for the humanitarian aid. I always went into the field with a lot of questions and little check marks. But in the end, I didn't even believe in those sheets that I carried with me. I believed more what I was seeing. And I think seeing what is going on there, listening to what people are saying, and vice versa. The ones who can come to Canada, like I mentioned now, this women's conference, if there's a women's delegation, and there have been 2 other occasions of women's delegations coming to Canada in the 2000s. And those events were absolutely amazing for the participants. I think your other question is more relevant for us here in Canada, is how can we get these experiences more known? How can we disseminate this kind of knowledge? How can we, there are so many stories that need to be told. And I'm not quite sure how to do it. We've tried. But there you go. I'm also a faith-based person, so which doesn't always fit in with political science.
I'd like to push Marius a little bit further on the desirability or otherwise of opening up diplomatic relations with North Korea that existed, and you participated in a period when you visited Pyongyang from time to time. I believe several other Canadian ambassadors did that. I think Ted Lipman did it when he was in Seoul. Is it not a slam dunk, as they say, to suggest that maybe the worse relations are, the more important it is to have somebody there on the scene to report directly to Ottawa and not have to have information filtered through other countries that are prepared to share their interpretation of events?
Well, I do think that it's a slam dunk, but back in 2010, and it was during Ted Lipman's, my successor, Ted Lipman's time, that the Harper government decided that, and I do believe for ideological reasons more than anything else, to limit our interaction with North Korea. And that's unfortunate. And it takes time to get back into that kind of game, if you like. It's an important one. from a Canadian perspective, whether it's about international security or our close relationship with South Korea and wanting to help South Korea. Also to give advice, I think, but credible advice based on what we actually see in North Korea to our friends in Washington, the future group that's supposed to be dealing with North Korea. And of course, as Paul has mentioned, we're going through a rough time with China, and I don't suspect that our diplomats in Beijing have called on the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs to say, hey, how can we help you? On that score. So again, I think the government has to think about accreditation again, and to return those modest relations that we had before, because I think we made some modest difference at that time, and hopefully before. I mean, Global Affairs Canada, just by having the task force and having some of these discussions with the North Koreans would be indicative that they want to move forward. And that's a good thing. Obviously, more consultations have to happen, and let's see. But we have to be eyes on the ground, I believe, is really important.
Paul? What do you think about the ambassadorial matter?
It's again a calculation right now. There's symbolic value. There can be eyes on the ground. But the question is how much ground can those eyes see? There's a political question of whether we want to signal to North Korea a series of measures. And I suspect that some of that has been put in place by that task force that you mentioned. If and when we see some movement, we could do this. So that's the political side of it. But I'd ask the hard question, what can you learn being based in North Korea? If we remember from our discussions with ambassadors who were based there in the year 2000, in the year 2000, they were asking us for information as we came in from the outside. Is there any signs that being on the ground allows you to see much more than your own toenails around? Have there been any opening in that sense in the North where having a presence could provide us new access? That's those of you who've been to North Korea more recently and have talked to the diplomats, I wonder what we're finding from the Brits and others.
I think we're almost at the time when we're scheduled to look at some of the questions from the listening and viewing audience. Could we go back to question number 1? The question is as follows. Paul spoke about, quote, windows to North Korea, and Marius also spoke about keeping our path with North Korea. How do we keep our window and pathways to North Korea? Erich had mentioned humanitarian aid as a tool, but how to facilitate that? How can we gain more credibility from North Korea in the provision of aid? That neatly brings in all 3 of you. So how do you keep the windows open, Paul?
Well, let me, at the beginning, when I was setting the context, I raised the matter of COVID and the great pandemic. And I think the kinds of questions that we can be thinking about is what to do around vaccines. What's the international cooperation or collaboration with North Korea? I'm sure the Chinese are having this kind of discussion. So I think even before we have the solution to COVID, are there any windows into North Korea, that would open what I might call soft COVAX or soft COVID diplomacy. Then the question afterwards, and it's one, Dawn, that we are discussing seriously at our university, although COVID has shut it down for the time being. Should we be ramping up? Can we ramp up the number of students we bring in? Should we do that with government support, not just for visas, but financially? Could we turn to the government to say have 50, remember, back to 2000, we were talking about 30 to 50 North Korean academics, teachers coming to Canada for an exchange program at the rate we were going to pick, remember, 3 or 4 each year for a decade. Should we be thinking about those things again? And right now, we can't muster the enthusiasm to do it. But if, as we see COVID starting to end, there will be some agitators here for us to try some educational exchanges. Trinity Western University had a very good program, training North Korean English language teachers. So we can start looking at that again, but it'll be in a post-COVID context. And I wonder if we can't do something Erich could speak to, or Marius, in a during COVID context that we should be trying with the North Koreans. Is there any way we can get some leverage?
Marius, what about pathways?
Well, it's, back in 2010, we closed a number of windows that I think we have to open up again. And that means talking, for instance, at the diplomatic level to our North Korean counterparts in Geneva, as I used to do, that I had to do in terms of the Conference on Disarmament, for instance, which got me into trouble with Foreign Minister Baird. But it was a small thing, but you just keep at it. And it's, you have to have faith, if you like, to make sure that by small gestures, you just get ready to do more when the time is right. I go back to my Vietnam experience here. Vietnam was a pretty tough place, having won the American War, having beaten the Chinese, having beaten the French. They were on a nationalistic roll, but then they started to learn about the outside world and the benefits of doing more and engaging more. Well, maybe it'll take a little bit more time and patience where North Korea, they want more tourism. Okay, well, let's see what we can do in these small, modest ways.
Erich, would you agree that a precondition would be the demonstration of great patience in any undertakings of opening windows or following pathways?
Oh, patience.
Yes.
Buckets of it. Yes, absolutely. I mean, look, we've been going around in circles for 70 years now. And I mean, the discussions I hear, I can go back 10 years ago and I can hear them. I can go 20 years ago and back. Each time, similar discussion about similar issues again and again and again. I mean, there's always new aspects to it, and North Korea has changed despite what it appears from the outside, but the inside North Korea, a lot of things have changed, and it would be good to have been there to see those changes a little more, close up. How we do that in the era of the pandemic, of course, you're quite right there, Paul. This is right now very difficult. There have been some, in fact, one of the people who wrote in the chat reminded me that MSF has gone back to North Korea just in 2019. There are other health-related organizations that have been working in North Korea all through this time. This is one area, I suppose, that might even be welcomed by North Korea to have assistance in how to deal with, especially if we get to the point of having a vaccine for it. That may be another way of opening up. But it is a matter that's going to need patience, and we can't expect things to happen in a quick way. They haven't been happening that way in the past. And some of us, like myself, I'm pretty much at the end of my patience by now, and I should stop pursuing this anymore because it's a hard thing to do. But I'm sure there are others who can jump in, and I've mentioned some of the women organizations that are very gung-ho right now, and I think have good possibilities of re-energizing this whole idea of having a positive connection. And then, yeah, I think I'll stop there. But yes, patience, please.
A questioner asks, Erich, how can we draw attention to Korea in Canada, about human rights, peace, and aid? You mentioned Korean issues unknown to Canadians. Are there ways that the ambassador and other Korean resources could be mobilized to do this effectively?
Well, I think certainly if we did have an ambassador accredited to North Korea, even with all the limitations that would be involved there, at least some kind of communication could come back from visits. And in terms of the media, I mean, they like to have high-level people. I mean, if we can't send some rock star to North Korea and come back to talk about it, I have struggled with this for 20 years now, just getting the story out in terms of humanitarian aid. I think a better job was done and is still being done on the human rights angle. Better job is being done on the nuclear issue. I mean, all the negatives get a lot of play on North Korea. The trick is finding some of the positives or some of the hopeful aspects of North Korea in order to give some push to people who will be excited if things are in fact not as dreary as they are. It's a bit like trying to figure out how to deal with the climate crisis. I mean, it is so big that people just shut their eyes to it. It's just too much to take in. And I think individual small stories, if we had North Koreans coming for visits, whether it's agricultural or whether it's sport or whatever, those stories would be interesting. The same in reverse. If there are groups or experts of one sort or another, or artists of one sort or another going to North Korea, they would be able to tell a story that could interest the media and get it spread around. But that's about all I can suggest on that area. We just need to continue to, those of us who are interested need to continue to push this issue. I would like to actually ask some of the people from the Korean community. I know that the Korean Canadian community is not at all a unified force, and there are many differences of opinion. And I would like to ask how many of Canadian Koreans would be actually happy about the National Unification Advisory Committee and the work that they do. How much support do they have? There are many activities of Korean Canadians in North Korea, also on the humanitarian level, that we never hear about. I've never been able to actually produce a list of Korean Canadian organizations who are active in North Korea. Now, I agree. I mean, I can understand that, you know, confidentiality is probably required there. So it can't be, we can't expect as much openness as we do for the rest of us Canadians. But I would certainly, I would welcome if there was more of a telling the story, even stories, for example, of family reunions, what impact that has had, you know, what all these kinds of stories that show that there are people in North Korea that want to relate to South Koreans and to overseas Koreans. Some of those stories are wonderful, and I would like to see more of those told in the English language as well. And I think they would have an impact.
Paul, you and I are the two people here who have currently positions at universities. Erich makes the point that it would be very helpful to have spokesmen on this issue. Should we be looking for the spokespersons amongst the very hardworking and very brilliant cadre of Korean students and Korean Canadian students in Canadian universities? Seems to me there's a tremendous talent reservoir there that isn't really being tapped very well on this particular issue.
Don, that's hard to tell. And I think that if there were one recommendation that the panel might make to the National Unification Advisory Council, it is to do a next session with people under the age of 35. As much as some of us might wish to look like we're under 35, we're not there. And I raise this not because there's necessarily going to be an overwhelming attitude about the advantages of engagement, of opening those windows, but because in my students, the occasional Korean students I have in my classes, just like the much more numerous Chinese students, people from the mainland or of mainland descent, surprisingly, how critical they are about their own country, whether that is South Korea or whether none of them are from North Korea. We can't get that kind of conversation. But how critical they are because of one big issue, and that's human rights. And this human rights question cuts in multiple directions. But in general terms, this is not a good news story in North Korea. And students are going to, they're critical of the world, the outside world. Some of them can come to terms with having a nuclear North Korea, and they think the Americans have forced them into some of the bad positions they have. But as soon as the topic turns to human rights in North Korea, it is very difficult for them to accept the premise that we either close our eyes or at least put over to the side human rights issues to want to then deal with the diplomacy issues, how we can move with North Korea on the nuclear or the other problems. So I say this in the hope that there can be discussions around this topic with that younger generation, both our students, but the young professionals. Yona Martin used to be extremely active, and perhaps she still is, in trying to bring people of Korean descent into the conversation that we're having today. And I know universities would like to facilitate that and assist it, but I'm not sure of what the actual outcome would be.
If I could just add to the human rights situation, I have found that the South Korean government these days have been very, very quiet, low level, low keyed, because North Korea, Chairman Kim is so prickly about it. But there's also another issue that goes back to Kim Dae-jung, actually, in their first bilateral announcement, and that was their agreement, and that was that they would not interfere with the internal actions of each country. And that type of agreement has been put into subsequent agreements, going all the way to the last one on in terms of Panmunjom and Pyongyang. So there is, the South Korean government itself playing the long nuclear game is in a bit of a bind in terms of how they can critique North Korea's human rights situation. And by the way, the Commission of Inquiry that the Human Rights Council was able to establish was established in the year that neither China nor Russia were members of that of the Human Rights Council. They had to take a year off between 6 years on. And so good, but where do you go from there? Including discussions, it's supposed to, the Security Council is supposed to be seized with the issue, and they're not.
We just have time for one more question, a rather plaintive one. Should we keep our faith in this peace process? Could we continue believing after Erich's 30-year journey? Can we celebrate small victories in the journey?
Yes, definitely. Yes, we should. I was in fact going to say about this human rights thing, it's not a matter of ignoring the human rights problem in North Korea. It's a matter of finding ways to deal with North Korea about their human rights issues. And if we only deal with human rights in terms of accusations in a kind of a law and order way, that we judge them because we are so good and they are so bad, and we can point to how bad they are with all the details, that's never going to work in any country. Seriously. I had an issue in the World Council of Churches when I was dealing with human rights, and the Norwegian church, the head of the Norwegian church at that time, was at me about, we should do more work on the human rights in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union and so on. And then one day I received a visit by a group of the Sami people who wanted us to help them to communicate with the Norwegian government and the church there about their issues. And when I wrote the letter to the bishop, I got such a cross response saying, keep out of it, it's none of your business. So any country is going to be nervous about that. So we need to find a different way of dealing with those issues with North Korea. And I would like to point out again, the work done by the people who are working on handicapped issues. And there has been a big step forward in how that one community in North Korea has been treated by the government, the kind of activities that are now going on, involved in sports and all kinds of things. I don't have all the details, but it's there. And it's the first United Nations human rights related person that was actually allowed to go to Pyongyang. The name escapes me now. But if you deal with it in a different way and have the patience and not see it as a crime and punishment situation, I think we can step by step move forward.
Yeah. Thank you, Eric. We have only a minute or two left. Marius, would you have any final comments?
No, I think we raised a lot of issues of how Canada should deal with North Korea going forward, but it has raised so many other elements and challenges. And I think certainly I'm coming away saying, yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there that we have to work at, and yes, patience is necessary to move forward.
Don, the agonies of engagement, the essential quality of engagement, and where I think ultimately it is the Canadian game that we can play best in this context. Bob Scalapino, the American scholar who spent a lot of time on Korean Peninsula issues, Robert Scalapino, used to be asked, are you an optimist or are you a pessimist about where things are going on the Korean Peninsula? And the Scalapino answer was interesting. He said on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, boy, I can see the clouds. I can see the irreconcilable problems that are in front of us. On Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, however, I see some possibilities. On Sunday, I take a day of rest. I don't try to think through those problems. But this is a Wednesday. And if we are looking for one sign at the geopolitical level, it could be that a Biden administration can take some creative steps on something more nuanced than complete, irreversible, verifiable dismantlement of the North Korean nuclear problem. If that can be managed in a way that moves towards allowing either de facto or de jure recognition of North Korea as a nuclear weapons state, then we may have an opening that will allow a lot of other things to happen. That's geopolitically. And then if we're smart enough in Canada to mobilize our resources, I think we can play our engagement game well. But I think until the geopolitical clouds clear on this one, we're only going to be tinkering at the edges and hoping for miracles that we can't predict, but that we hope for.
Thank you, Paul. I believe Senator Martin in Ottawa would like to say a few words to our group. Senator Martin, welcome.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I listened to everything very, very carefully. I just came out of a National Defense and Security Committee organizational meeting, which is why I was late. So you've given me much food for thought, and I just want to thank the distinguished panelists whom I have known for a number of years. I think I've known Dr. Paul Evans the longest when I served on the NUAC Advisory Council in BC. So if I may just congratulate and thank the National Unification Advisory Council of Eastern Chapter, Mr. Kim, and I know Jay Chong and all the members who put a lot of effort into bringing us together. I also see some Westerners on this call, my fellow British Columbians. I think some of them have called in. Of course, Dr. Evans is also from BC. And you know, today's a Wednesday, so I actually am leaving with a lot of like food for thought, but like hope. And I enjoyed what each of you said to provide a more fulsome perspective. And I see a lot of hope actually in what's happened in the past, but also going forward. And on tonight's attendee, you know, the participation for tonight, I see Nellie Shin, the first elected Korean Canadian MP, Susan Ritchie, who has been this incredible angel and champion, and Senator Lois Wilson. I hear about her often, and I just haven't had a chance to talk to her about the specific work she did on the Hill, but I know that her legacy has been passed on, and many people talk about her. So you're absolutely right. To all three of you, thank you for your incredible dedication on this file, as well as our very, very apt moderator, who was able to just have this incredibly rich conversation, presentation to inspire those of us who have listened carefully. And the Korean community, you're right, they're very divided from one end to the other. But I think about Dr. Kyung-Hae Park of UBC and her KPP program, these professors I have met on a number of occasions. And when I see them, I just see, you know, people of Korean descent, where my father was born in the North. And when I see the defectors from, you know, North Korea, like Han Voice is an advocacy group who have brought young people to Canada. And one of the first pioneers, you know, he looked across the river at China that was so lit. And he said his mind was just going, you know, it's so bright over there. Maybe, what can I do here to brighten up my world? So that's where his journey began. So I think that there's a lot of hope and a lot of good ideas, and I look forward to following up in ways that I can. Thank you so much for this evening that has really brought a lot of ideas and important issues forward. And on behalf of the Senate of Canada, here in Ottawa, our parliament, we need to do more, and I look forward to being a part of some of the solutions to take the next steps. So thank you so much, everyone. God bless you.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to call upon Dr. Gerald Wright from Carleton University to thank the speakers.
Well, as Senator Martin said, this has been an excellent evening, really amply justifying the postponement of dinner on the part of those of us in the Eastern time zone. And the question that was put to us was whether Canada should care. And I think it's evident that there are a significant number of Canadians and significant Canadians who do care. I approached this evening with really three questions in mind. The first one was really, what is the key to a brighter future for the Korean Peninsula? And I think Paul Evans drew attention to one key, which is that although foreign policy gurus don't always like to admit it, foreign policy begins at home. And the better that outside democracies can get their own house in order, the better that we can cure the issue of international organizations being in disarray, the more effective actor we will be. And the better that is, that we can make the community of democracies work, and that should have a big impact on the on issues like the Korean Peninsula. Secondly, Ambassador Chang drew attention to the closeness of Canada-Korean relations in the past 70 years, and the question that occurs to me is Canada's stance on Korea driven by Canadian voluntarism, an instinct to make the world a better place, or is it the result of a calculated decision to do what is in Canada's interest? The latter would appear to be the way that Marius Grinius is tending. As Marius also implied, this is one part of a broader question about how Canada defines its role and its interests in the Asia Pacific. A vitally important question, because the Asia Pacific is going to increasingly shape our world, our governance systems, our interpretation of the world order, the direction of our economic lives. And every move we make in the region, whether it's sending a combat vessel to enforce sanctions on North Korea, or asking the UN Human Rights Council to decide whether China's behavior in Xinjiang constitutes genocide, will help determine the credibility that Marius Grinius obviously thinks is so important, and the influence that we can bring to bear. Finally, is there a more innovative way in which we can cast the whole issue? Something that will make us bring to light some new factor that we haven't been thinking of, and be able to escape the dreary pessimism that must necessarily attach to this issue, considering the years that it has gone on. We might well ask Erich Weingartner, notwithstanding the pessimism he sometimes expressed, and I don't think it was entirely convincing, Erich, has made us think about how we should think about the whole issue and what our emotional responses to it should be. Erich was refreshingly frank in helping us to understand the political ramifications of humanitarian aid, and I must say opened my eyes a lot to the different dimensions of that subject. So it remains to me to thank a number of people. I think firstly, Ambassador Chang for his support of this project and his superb overview of Canadian-Korean relations. Paul Evans for giving us the geopolitical picture. Marius Grinius for wrestling with the question of what Canada should and might do. Erich Weingartner for challenging us to think outside the box. And Don Rickerd for ably moderating the session. And of course, also the Korean National Unification Advisory Council, Toronto chapter, for our hosts for organizing this venture, and all of you, those who asked questions and those who didn't, and who by your presence lent your support to a very useful dialogue that I can see bearing fruit in time to come. Thank you very much, and over to you, Jay.
I'd add my words of thanks to the panelists, and I hope we will keep in close touch with each other and forward our mission, which is the subject of our discussions tonight. Thank you all again. Good.
Thank you, Gerard. Thank you, Gerard, for your very eloquent vote of thanks to our excellent speakers. Now, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all organizing committee members, especially Jennifer Rogman, Won-hee Lee, and Emma Lim for their tireless dedication, as well as all technical members, Matthew, Jamin, and Nicholas. This concludes the 2020 Korea Peace Forum. Thank you for your participation. Have a wonderful evening.